Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yacker. My guest on today's show is distinguished author, journalist, and lecturer Ralph Blumenthal. He was an award-winning reporter for the New York Times and co-authored the Times article in 2017 that broke the news of a secret Pentagon unit investigating UFOs. I'll be yakking with Ralph about his remarkable book, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack. Ralph Blumenthal, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thanks, Stan. It's a pleasure.
Totally mutual. For those people in my audience who may not have heard of John Mack, could you tell me, Ralph, who he was, when and how you became aware of him, and what was there about him and the road he traveled in life that got your attention, sparked your creative juices, and ultimately resulted in you writing his biography?
John Mack was a distinguished psychiatrist and professor at Harvard. He had written a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on Lawrence of Arabia. He had done a lot of good work with poor mental health patients. He had protested nuclear weapons in Arizona and New Mexico. He tried to make peace in the Middle East. And he did a lot of good things before he ever got into the alien abduction business. And how I found out about him was in 2004. I was a New York Times correspondent in Texas, and I happened to pick up a copy of his second book, Passport to the Cosmos. I didn't know anything about him, but I thought the idea of a Harvard professor who was interested in aliens and alien abduction had to be a good story. And I didn't realize he was already famous. He had been on Oprah. He had written 2 books. He had been put under investigation by Harvard for his unorthodox research and was fully cleared. All that I didn't know. But anyway, I thought it would be a good story for the Times. I was going to call him up and try to get an interview. A few days later, I pick up the paper and find he's been run over in London and killed by a drunk driver. That got me going. I called his family. I got access to his archives. For 16 years, I worked on the book. That's the short version. The long version is the book.
Yeah, and it's a great book. Having read it, it's really quite absorbing. Dr. John Mack, an eminent Harvard psychiatrist and Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, as you mentioned, risked his career to investigate the phenomenon of human encounters with alien beings. Who or what was the catalyst, the defining moment that convinced him human encounters with aliens did happen?
He went through a process which I outline in the book. He was very grounded on Earth in terms of his psychiatric services. As I said, his biography of Lawrence of Arabia that won a Pulitzer Prize. He went out to Esalen, that think tank on the Pacific, in the late 80s. He got interested in this breathing discipline called holotropic breathing, where he altered his states of consciousness by controlling his breathing without drugs, although he also experimented with psychedelic drugs. He was beginning to get open to the idea that there was a spiritual dimension to the universe that was not covered by his training at Harvard, everything he had studied until then. And then he got an introduction to Bud Hopkins, an artist who was doing a lot of research in these strange encounters that people were reporting with alien beings. At first, he shrugged it off, John Mack. He wasn't interested. He read the letters that people sent to Bud Hopkins based on Bud Hopkins' research. And John Mack was intrigued. He was a psychiatrist, so he was interested in aberrant states and what could possibly explain these encounters that people were reporting in great detail. And John Mack quickly saw, based on his own interviews, that these people were not crazy. They were not mentally ill in any way. They were completely ordinary except for these encounters. There were a whole bunch of other factors that convinced him that he had stumbled onto something really interesting. The stories were consistent. They came from people from all walks of life, educated, not educated, blue collar, white collar, men, women, old, young, and particularly children as young as 2 years old. We're talking about being taken up into the sky by beings. These children who were barely able to speak, obviously were not getting this from movies or books they had read. They didn't get it from the culture. So something was going on. Some of these people had scars afterwards. Some of them reported a UFO in the vicinity outside their window before their encounters. It wasn't only at night when they were sleeping, but sometimes driving their car during the day. Sometimes third parties were witness to some of these strange encounters. So putting all this together, together, John Mack realized that something was going on that he could not explain. It was not, what the debunkers, the so-called critics were saying, oh, it's, sleep paralysis or, mental illness, or they were publicity seeking. These people didn't want publicity. They were running away from publicity. All these things, which I develop in my book, convinced Dr. Mack that something was going on that he couldn't explain.
How did John Mack's relatives and close friends react to his pursuit of validating experiencers and his desire to give them the credibility he felt they deserved? Did they try to discourage him, or were they supportive of him?
His wife, Sally, was supportive. She didn't necessarily share all his convictions. She wasn't privy to all the things he was finding out. And some of his colleagues, it was mixed. Some supported him because they knew he was an eminent psychiatrist and he was serious, and anything he delved into was bound to be interesting. Many others shrugged it off as an aberration that John Mack had lost it. People at Harvard couldn't imagine what had taken him on this path. Some of them were fellow psychiatrists who had also met some of these people and shrugged them off and said, these people are obviously deranged in some way. Oh, it can't be true. John Mack agreed, this can't be true in our conventional understanding of reality. There's nothing about these stories that ring a bell with people who haven't had these experiences. Clearly, they're very hard to swallow, these stories. But when you start eliminating all the things that Mack eliminated, he was left like Sherlock Holmes. When you eliminate all the things that can't be true, then you're left with the truth. He felt in some way what these people were saying was true, even though he agreed it can't be happening in our conventional understanding of reality.
John Mack had legal difficulties with Harvard academic authorities who saw his work with UFO experiences as being outside the limits of his academic and medical roles. And yet, with so many powerful people in academia trying to put him down, he suffered no adverse career consequences. What do you attribute that to?
Harvard tried. They called it at one point when they called him in. They said, this is not an inquisition. And you can't tell a psychiatrist what something is not and use that word. So right away, he thought, yeah, maybe it is an inquisition. In my book, I kind of say, yes, it was an inquisition because it was very intrusive. It was secret. It delved into his own beliefs and his practices. What he was able to show with the help of two very powerful lawyers he got, and I'll take a minute to describe them. One was Danny Sheehan, who had investigated the Ku Klux Klan. He was a Jesuit lawyer who'd had an interesting encounter of his own, a sighting that convinced him that there was something to this UFO business. And he had investigated the Iran-Contra arms deal in the Reagan administration. He was a very powerful lawyer. The other was Eric McLeish, who had broken the priest abuse scandal in Boston. He was used to controversy and wading into tough areas. The two of them put Harvard's feet to the fire and said, just what is it that John Mack is doing wrong? And Mack, through a lot of back and forth with Harvard, convinced Harvard that there was something to this mystery that he could not explain, but that he had gone through the proper protocols. He didn't do anything wrong. The worst thing he did, and he admitted this, and it was a failure on his part, and I don't paint him as a perfect scientist by any means. What he did wrong was he let his enthusiasm get in the way. He threw himself into things sometimes without proper precautions, or thinking, how will this look? This could backfire. So he didn't take a lot of steps that a more cautious investigator might have taken. That doesn't take away from his courage and the fact that he did all the right things. He investigated these people to a fairly well. The first book he wrote, Abduction, really included 13 case studies of abductees. Sometimes they didn't give their full names, although their identities in many cases came out afterwards with their agreement that they cooperated with telling of their stories. But anyway, he outlined their cases in great clinical detail. Every time I read his first book, Abduction, I am amazed at the learning and the brilliance that he applied to this task. This was not a gullible guy who swallowed everything people said. He investigated their stories, he investigated their backgrounds, and he said that these were absolutely normal people who had something completely abnormal happen to them. Something happened to them he couldn't explain. And that, in the end, won the day at Harvard. They couldn't pin anything on him. They basically said, don't be quite so enthusiastic. And he said, okay, I won't. Otherwise, he was free to continue his research.
It is clear from your book, Ralph, that John Mack was fascinated with the alien abductions phenomenon, and he willingly took the reports of abductees at face value. Why was he so sure that the abductees were telling him the truth about their experiences?
I wouldn't say he took them at face value. He found them as strange as anyone would find them. And as a matter of fact, the stories are stranger than anything we can imagine. Actually, when you read the accounts, it's not just the stuff we get from movies or TV about people being snatched or kidnapped by aliens and taken to a spaceship. There are so many really weird aspects to this and the details. What convinced him was that the stories were generally consistent. Different people were telling the same story, which mystified him. People from all over the world and all over the country, and different people, as I said, from all kinds of different backgrounds. It seemed to run in families. The grandparents had some experiences, their children, and then their grandchildren. For some reason, it seemed to run in families. The stories were generally consistent, with many details different that were singular and almost impossible to make up. The details were so extraordinary. And for that, I would just refer anyone to my book and John Mack's book, Abduction, and read it for yourself. These are the stories people told. What convinced him also was that there was this association with UFOs, that they would look out the window at night if they were at home in bed, but not always at night, driving a car, and see a UFO in the proximity, but not in every case. There were cases of people encountering alien beings without a UFO present, but this is the general background. Sometimes when they woke up in the morning or when they emerged from whatever experience they had scars they could not explain or they didn't remember getting, as if somebody had taken little bits of their body for some kind of surgery that healed very quickly. There were, as I said, the accounts of the children who couldn't be making this up. The people were not publicity seekers. On the contrary, they were ashamed of what had happened to them, although they had no part in it. They were not looking to capitalize on their experience. As I said, on the contrary, they were afraid that if this got out, people would think they were mad. And in some cases, and this is probably the most interesting aspect, there were third parties who testified to witnessing some of these experiences. So, for example, if a husband and wife would have this experience, or one of them would have this experience at night, the other might be rendered comatose or switched off in some way, couldn't really witness this, but witnessed enough of it to know that something strange had happened to his or her partner. And in one famous case that John Mack wrote about, and this is really one of the most striking cases, two teenage girls had a sleepover. The mother of one of the girls came down during the night to check on the girls, and they were missing. And she called the police, and they did a big investigation. Obviously, there was great panic. They searched all over, couldn't find them. And a few hours later, the girls turned up again in their beds. Later, they remembered seeing a UFO outside the window and having some kind of an encounter. What makes that story interesting is that here's the mother who testified that the girls were missing at a time when they later remembered some kind of an encounter. That is compelling. Now, there were other cases John Mack wrote about where people weren't missing. A woman fainted in the arms of her husband and then remembered flying, being levitated up into the sky and having some experiences, while the husband said she was in my arms. They are two opposite accounts, with witnesses, but there were some witnesses to some of these things, but never enough to make it scientifically compelling.
John Mack himself admitted the physical evidence of UFOs and extraterrestrials visiting our planet was limited. How did he explain that lack of physical evidence?
This was very difficult for everybody in this field. It does not act like normal events. Let me differentiate the alien encounter aspect from UFO sighting, which, thanks to the Pentagon now, we have corroboration of. The Director of National Intelligence said in his report of June 25th that these UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, which is now the preferred term, exist physically. These things are real, and that was a big breakthrough. And not only are they real, but they represent a potential threat to other aviation in terms of near close calls, collisions. So now we have an authority, the Pentagon itself, saying that yes, these things exist. They're not marsh gas or the planet Venus or delusions or fly specks on the windshield. These objects, whatever they are, we don't know what they are, where they come from, who's running them, if anybody or anything. They exist. So that's a big breakthrough. That has been captured by Navy and Air Force technology. Take a leap to the alien encounter stories where this kind of scientific evidence has not been gathered. In fact, efforts to gather it have come to naught. People have set up cameras in their bedrooms, tried to capture images, record recordings, nothing works. That is a hallmark of this phenomenon. It is a central aspect of this phenomenon, whatever it is, does not get recorded. That troubled John Mack until he realized, again, this is not a failure of technology in some way. So this is a crucial aspect of this phenomenon. It does not allow itself to be documented. That's just a fact. That has happened again and again, and people have had their memories interfered with, wiped out, or they don't remember what happened the night before. And in hypnosis or other memory enhancing techniques, some of that comes out. Hypnosis has its own problems in terms of, controversial history. People have had better memories when the memories have been enhanced, let's say, by different relaxation techniques. And yet they're never crystal clear recounting of what had happened to them. It's all vague. It's another part of the phenomenon. And Mack came to realize this. At first he thought, gee, if I could only get these people to tell me what happened, I could figure it out. He couldn't, and no one has to this day. That is one of the problems of this field, is that it is short of scientific documentation for whatever reason. Now, maybe more science needs to be applied, and, testing of people, the brain functions of people who've had these experiences, and check the cellular structure, see if they've had any changes to their molecular, structure, et cetera. At this point, scientific evidence is lacking.
The Believer is based on exclusive access you had to archives, journals, and psychiatric notes, as well as interviews with his family and closest associates. Did any of his family members or close associates reveal things about him that you did not expect to hear and surprised you when you heard them?
John Mack was a real human being. He had strengths and weaknesses. His history, that I go into it at some length in The Believer, was that his mother died when he was 8.5 months old. She died of appendicitis. Penicillin had just come into use, but not widely, and she might have been saved today. She couldn't be saved then. She was 25 years old. So very sad. And he was 8.5 months old. He didn't know what had happened to his mother, who was suddenly, yanked away. He spent his whole life searching for that elusive missing component of his life. And this found reality in his search for love outside his marriage, good marriage with Sally. He loved his wife. She loved him, but he was attracted to other women. He was always searching for something missing in his life. And I talk about that in the book. And I was kind of surprised at the candor that he and other people offered in discussing this part of his life. I talked to some of the women he was involved with, and his wife, Sally, before she died of cancer. I was privileged to meet her, and she was always in love with him and supported him and struggled with this aspect of their lives. I guess I was surprised at the intimacy that I was able to get into his life, because he wrote everything down and he taped everything, including his own therapy sessions. Psychiatrists have to submit to psychotherapy themselves. When he would talk to one of his therapists, a guru, a Sikh therapist, who was helpful to me also in terms of interviews, he didn't hold back. He talked about his life, his frustrations in researching the whole alien encounter phenomenon, how difficult it was, how people were against him. I was really happy, thrilled to get access to this information that the family, they didn't hold anything back. The only thing I couldn't get was some of the therapy sessions he had with his patients or subjects, because they're covered by medical confidentiality. But a number of these people came forward later, and some of these tapes did surface in other ways. So I didn't use the names of some of these people who didn't agree to use of their names, but that came out too. Everything came out about John Mack's methods, his mindset, his relationships. And I was amazed. It's every biographer's dream to have access to an archive like this. And I got it. And I didn't have to deal with him. Often a biographer will get access to this material, but then they'll have a recalcitrant subject who'll say, oh, don't use this, or say this about me, or I don't want that. Fortunately, he wasn't around. I had access to this material, and I didn't have him leaning over my shoulder, second guessing me. I would have liked to have his input for sure. It wasn't available, but I did have the next best thing, which was all his archives.
Earlier in the interview, you had mentioned about interviewing all types of people, including children, the youngest being 2 years of age. I'm curious to know, was any follow-up done on abducted children when they reached adulthood?
Yes, in fact, one of the most famous cases that he investigated was of an incident in Zimbabwe in southern Africa at a day school outside the capital Battle of Harare in 1995, I believe, where 60 different children out of the 300 at the school reported seeing a UFO landing and two beings come out and interacting telepathically with the children and sending messages that they have to take better care of the planet, things like that. They weren't hostile. They didn't threaten the children. They scared the children because the children knew that there was something very strange about this incident. But afterwards, they drew pictures of it. Their parents agreed to interviews with John Mack on film. And later, a documentary was made. It's in the works now. It may soon come out by one of the experiencers John Mack interviewed, Randy Nickerson, who I've also interviewed, who made a film of this and tracked some of these people 25 years later. They never forgot this incident. As children, they recounted it, what they saw. And again, they weren't looking for publicity. These children of 9, 10, 11 years old, they were very articulate, English speaking, of all races, all backgrounds. They told a consistent story. Nothing contradicted each other. They all saw these beings. And then years later, they talked about remembering this as one of the most important events of their lives. To answer your question, yes, there has been follow-up.
The Believer is filled with details, both pro and con, on the topic of alien encounters. Which detail would you put on top of the pro list, and which detail would you put as number one on the con list?
That's a good question. First of all, the lack of scientific confirmation is a big problem in this field. And that's what excites the skeptics and all of us. Let's face it, if the people cannot document these encounters, ultimately, you're left unsatisfied. Anecdotal evidence goes only so far. It is used in court to convict people. As John Mack said, you can get the death penalty against people with eyewitness testimony that has no other corroboration. People get convicted all the time based on that. But it leaves us all unsatisfied that in the end, you can't come up with some physical proof or some scientific proof of these encounters. And the fact that they are so vivid to the people, it makes it all the more puzzling that they are adamant. And this is, again, one of the things that convinced John Mack that these things had happened in some dimension, on some level, that the people recounting what happened to them or what they remembered happening to them was so vivid and so dramatic. They would cry and scream and curse. On the one hand, you have these very vivid parent memories, and on the other hand, no backup. What I find compelling is what John Mack found compelling, and he was a psychiatrist. I don't have that kind of training, but these people were very convincing. They had no motive to lie. On the contrary, it only hurt them to admit to these experiences. The consistency of the stories, the fragmentary bits of evidence that did surface, the sightings of UFOs in the vicinity, the third-party corroboration, the scars, the little children, all these things made a picture. So at the top of the pro column, as you say, I would put the fact that nobody has ever come up with any explanation that satisfies all these criteria. As John Mack said, in the end, he was left to believe that these things that people say happened did happen in some dimension of reality that we don't recognize, but that was very real to them and that did happen. And all the other explanations fall by the wayside.
In addition to his interest in the abduction phenomenon, Dr. Mack was intrigued with the possibility of the survival of consciousness after death. In the epilogue section of your book, you include a number of possible after-death communications by Mack to former close associates. Could you expand on any of them?
John Mack did range widely. Let me just talk for a moment about his trajectory. As I said, he started off very conventionally in psychiatry and social action, and through his series of experiences that he had, the holotropic breathing and the letters that he saw and the people he interviewed, he became convinced that there was something real about these encounters with alien beings. Towards the end of his life, and he died, he was run over at almost 75. In his last years, he did get interested in other anomalous phenomena. He realized that alien abduction stories were related to other strange things that humanity has grappled with forever. Ghost stories, sightings of mythical monsters, the Loch Ness Monster, and crop circles, which he investigated, some of which were hoaxes, some of which remain unexplained. These formations in the wheat fields of England, particularly, that looked like it was made by some intelligent force. He started to range widely. One of the areas he was particularly interested in, particularly at the end of his life, was survival of consciousness, what happens after we die. He got very interested in the case of a young psychiatrist he was very impressed with, who died early. She was gifted in many ways in terms of psychic gifts, apparently, but she died of brain cancer, and her family said that her spirit appeared to them after she died. And John Mack was checking this out like he checked out the abduction stories. And then he was run over and killed in London at the end of my book. And I separated this out at the very end. And I said, I'm not imbuing these stories with the same credibility necessarily that other material in the book has, because there's no way to verify this. Different people said, and again, with no apparent motive to lie, told me in interviews that they had encounters with his spirit after he died. They found it very strange indeed. It seemed to be a confirmation of what Mack was looking into, that this consciousness survives after death, and the death of the body doesn't mean the death of the spirit, that there's some consciousness that survives and that can travel and can manifest itself after death. I found it very intriguing, like so many other mysteries in the book. I lay it out. I don't take a position on it. I say, this is what people said. There's reason to respect their credibility. They had no evident reason to lie, but these are the stories. That's where I left it.
When it comes to UFOs and alien abductions, what is your feeling, Ralph, on the subject? After all the research you've done, do you find yourself a believer, a denier, or somewhere in between? And did you ever give thought to what you would say to an alien being if you encountered one?
Well, I have not had any UFO sightings like John Mack, neither of us, nor any encounters with alien beings. Again, John Mack never had that. For a time, he thought he felt bad. He wished he had, but then he realized, well, he's probably a better witness not having had any experiences. So it's not like he was trying to justify something that happened to him. I'll take the first part and say that I dealt with this in a New York Times article I did on the whole concept of believer. UFOs now, thanks to the Pentagon, their physical existence has been confirmed. So it's not a question of belief. Even now, particularly, even back then, you might as well ask, do you believe in the ocean or the stars or the moon? It's there, and the UFOs are there. We don't know what they are and where they come from or what they want of us or what intelligence, if any, is behind them. But you don't have to believe in them. They're there. They're unidentified. They're physically real, which we only know in the last few years. And as I said, alien beings is a much more difficult leap. That same scientific confirmation does not exist. And we can't say that. We cannot say that about them. I've had a spiritual journey all my life. I consider myself spiritual in the sense that I think that there's more to reality in the cosmos than we understand now. And we're only at the beginning of understanding a lot of things. Physics is raising more questions than ever about what is the nature of reality, where the universe came from, what forces make up the universe. 95% of the universe is unknown, is a mystery. Dark matter and dark energy making up the vast bulk of the universe. We just don't know what these forces are. We're discovering particles like the Higgs boson in the last few years, one tiny particle after billions of collisions. Our knowledge of the universe is really in its infancy. I don't know what I would say to an alien being. I guess I would be terrified, like a lot of people have been terrified and traumatized, which is really the primary reaction because they don't know what's happening to them. People who told John Mack of these experiences said, Dr. Mack, I was hoping you would tell me I was crazy. I would be more comfortable knowing that I'm insane. But when you tell me that other people have had these experiences and that there's something going on here, that is truly terrifying. I guess I wouldn't know unless I had that kind of experience, but the people who've had it have been really scared out of their minds. Later, they drew something from the experience, some of them, that they developed a closeness to some of these beings, actually, a feeling of love for the cosmos, the creator, creation itself, or feelings that the planet is in peril and we have to do something and become better stewards of planet Earth. So all these reactions people have talked about. It has got to be terrifying, the loss of control and the realization that there are forces operating that are completely alien to us in every sense of the word, and that we have no control over, and that our science has not helped us understand up to this point.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to order The Believer, Alien Encounters, Art Science, and The Passion of John Mack, how do they go about doing it?
Amazon, of course, Barnes & Noble, the chains have it, the independent bookstores have it. If they don't have it in stock, they'll order it. Kindle has it. For those who want to read it instantly, pop right up on your device. And now there's an audio book, I'm happy to say, as of a few months ago, where you can listen to it. I've had many letters from people who have trouble with their vision and they like to hear books, and now you can. It's easily available everywhere. And I would direct them to my website, ralphblumenthal.com, where there's more about the book. There's more about me. There's links to order the book. It's very easy to find.
Ralph Blumenthal, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I wish you an abundance of success with The Believer. I very much enjoyed yakking with you.
Stan, thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Totally mutual. Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you don't miss any interviews on my free YouTube channel, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.